A 6-foot sub valued at $25 is divided among 5 players. Using the last diminisher method, we're going to assign pieces, all right? So the way this table works is you're not seeing the process from start to finish, okay? Again, it's not a fluid thing because we don't have these people in front of us. We're not actually drawing lines and doing these situations. So what we're seeing in this table is the current C piece, the piece that's in front of them, what they view the value is when it gets to them. So player one makes the first cut every time, which is why they're not on the chart. Their cut would be exactly what they feel is a fair share. It's always going to be that case. What we're seeing here is the value of the piece when it gets to the next player. All right, so hopefully as I walk through this first example, you'll see kind of what we're doing with this. When the piece gets to player two, we have to decide if it's too big or too small. If it was too big, we would assume they trimmed it. So when we look at player three's value or player four's, that's now the trimmed piece that gets to them. It's not the original piece. It just goes down the line, and what we're seeing on every single number here is the piece when it gets to them, what they view the value is. So let's start with what a fair share is. We can't do this process looking at these monetary values without knowing what the minimum is, what a fair share is. So to find a fair share, let's remind ourselves real quick. A fair share is the total value divided by the number of players. So in this case, the total sub value was $25. And how many players were there? There were 5 players. So a fair share is $5 worth. So which player gets their share at the end of round 1? That's really what we're seeing here is singular round. This is not a situation, and I hope I didn't say this earlier, but I might have. This is not a situation where we have a whole piece of land and we're actually dividing up every single piece. What we're viewing when we see these examples is a current round. Someone cut a piece, and this is the value as it gets to each person down the line. So here, we're just determining who gets this piece, the one that we're seeing from this whole chart. This is a singular piece as it makes its way down the line. So player one cuts it, it goes to player two. I want you to ask yourself real quick, do you think player two will pass, or do you think they'll trim? Remember that a fair share is $5 worth. So player two looks at this and goes, that's about worth $3.50 to me. That's not enough. It needs to be at least $5 worth. So it moves on to player three. Player two passes. Player three now looks at the piece and says, oh, that looks like $7 to me. Well, that's bigger than a fair share, which means because they're not the last in line, they have to trim. And they trim down to what they feel is $5 worth. Trims down to $5 worth. And $5 worth might look different for someone than someone else, one person, one player, or another. All right, that's what we're seeing here. The valuation, people care about bread, people care about meat, people care about the toppings. All right, so it can change, it can look different for every single individual player. So player three trims down to what they feel is $5, and that's the piece that now player four is getting. And even after player three's trim, player four is looking at it and going, oh, $6.50 right there. Like that's a pretty big piece. So player four is also going to trim. They're going to trim a second time. They're going to trim down to $5 worth. And again, they have to trim all the way down to $5 worth because they're not last in line. There was still another player after them. Player five looks at that double trimmed piece now and says, that's worth $4. That's not enough. It needs to be at least $5. So that means player five passes. And the last person that had trimmed is the one that gets to keep it. So at the end of round one, player four claims the piece. And what is the value of the share to that player? So to player 4, how much was that piece worth that they got to keep? You may have seen I highlighted it there a second ago. All right, they get to keep a piece that is worth $5. They were not last in line, so they had to trim down to the fair share, to the exact value. They couldn't keep anything on top of that. That's how it works. All right, so it was worth $5 to them. And that's really the kind of example that we can do with last diminisher. We can do a single round. If you were given a second one, oh, now here's the new situation. You have to be given a new chart with that next piece that had been cut.